I had everything, but nothing fulfilled me until I saw him.
Alexander was a man who embodied what many would define as absolute success. At 45, he was the CEO of one of the most influential tech companies in the world, owner of a fortune that could have allowed him to retire several times over if he had wanted to. He wore tailored suits, drove cars that few could even pronounce, and lived in a penthouse offering views of the entire city as if he were perched above the world itself. Yet, Alexander lived with a constant sense of emptiness, a void he couldn't fill, not with multi-million-dollar bonuses, nor with dinners at exclusive restaurants, nor with the superficial admiration of those around him. In public, he was a charismatic leader, decisive, almost impenetrable. But in private, when the lights dimmed and the echo of his own home returned an oppressive silence, Alexander felt the weight of a life where everything had been sacrificed for success. He had lost touch with his family years ago. His aging parents lived in a small town he barely visited, and when he did, their conversations were filled with awkward silences. His siblings, once his confidants, had stopped inviting him to family gatherings because they knew he would never show up. He had no partner, no children, no close friends, because in his mind, relationships were distractions on the road to greatness. Alexander began each day before dawn. His alarm went off at 4:30 a.m., and without hesitation, he leapt out of bed. His routine was meticulously planned. 30 minutes of exercise, a quick breakfast, usually a bland, nutrient-packed smoothie, and then he dove straight into emails and planning his day. His schedule was timed to the second: meetings with stakeholders, strategic presentations, lunches with investors. Every decision he made seemed monumental, with consequences that could move markets. However, Alexander had stopped enjoying any part of his day years ago. He couldn't remember the last time he felt genuine excitement for a project or an achievement. Every new success was just another number, a higher metric on a never-ending graph. There were days when, even surrounded by people praising him, he felt like a ghost, a mere spectator in his own life. The stress was beginning to take its toll. Migraines were constant, and a sharp pain in his chest lingered on his most intense days. His doctor had warned him about the risks of his lifestyle, but Alexander simply ignored it. He didn't have time for weaknesses. It was on a Friday afternoon that something unexpected happened. Alexander had left the office slightly earlier than usual, hoping to avoid the city's traffic. His chauffeur, as always, took the fastest route to his luxurious penthouse, but an accident on the highway forced them to detour through less traveled streets. At first, Alexander, distracted by his phone, barely noticed the change in route. But then something caught his attention. The car stopped at a red light in a visibly rundown neighborhood. The facades of the houses were worn, the sidewalks cracked, and the colors dulled from years of neglect. But what truly caught his eye wasn't the buildings. It was a small figure running along the edge of the sidewalk. It was a boy no older than 10, wearing visibly worn clothes and shoes that barely covered his feet. The boy was chasing a ball that had seen better days, laughing with a joy so pure it seemed to light up the dreary surroundings. His laughter echoed in the air, a vibrant contrast to the monotony Alexander felt in his own life. For the first time in years, Alexander looked away from his phone. He watched the boy with curiosity, but also with a pang of discomfort. He couldn't understand how someone who so clearly had so little could seem so happy. When the light turned green, the car moved on, but something inside Alexander had shifted. The entire ride home, he couldn't stop thinking about the boy. There was something about his laughter, the carefree way he played, that stayed with him. It was as if the boy had shown him, if only for a moment, a kind of happiness that Alexander could no longer comprehend. The next morning, Alexander woke up with a sense of unease. For the first time in years, His packed schedule didn't interest him. He decided to cancel his commitments and, without overthinking it, asked his driver to take him back to the neighborhood where he had seen the boy. When he arrived, he stepped out of the car and began to walk. People on the streets glanced at him curiously. His expensive suit and commanding presence stood out in a place where the daily struggle for survival was evident. But Alexander paid no attention. He was searching for the boy. He finally found him, sitting on the edge of a sidewalk, clutching the same worn-out soccer ball and gazing at the horizon. Alexander felt a mix of nervousness and determination as he approached. "Hi," he said, managing an awkward smile. The boy looked at him curiously, but didn't say a word. "I saw you playing yesterday," Alexander continued. "You looked so happy." The boy finally spoke, his voice soft but confident. "Why wouldn't I be happy?" The simplicity of the response left Alexander speechless. The time Alexander spent with the boy, whose name was Luis, was like stepping into a reality he had completely ignored. Luis didn't have a father around, and his mother worked long hours cleaning houses, often coming home exhausted and worried about putting food on the table. Yet Luis spoke about his life with a naturalness Alexander couldn't understand. There was no complaint in his voice, only a serene acceptance mixed with a spark of gratitude for the little things many took for granted. Luis showed Alexander his favorite spot in the neighborhood, an improvised soccer field on an empty lot where dust and rocks substituted for grass. There, with a patched-up ball and an enthusiasm that surpassed every obstacle, Luis played with other children. Their energy was infectious. Alexander watched from the sidelines, feeling out of place, but unable to look away. At one point, Luis came over and said, "Why don't you play with us?" Alexander chuckled nervously. "I haven't played in years. Besides, I think I'm too old for this." Luis looked at him with an unexpected seriousness. No one is too old to have fun. The simplicity of those words hit him harder than any motivational speech ever could. Without thinking too much, Alexander took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and stepped onto the dusty field. The children laughed as this polished man stumbled over rocks while trying to keep up with the game. But as the minutes passed, something shifted. Alexander stopped worrying about how ridiculous he looked and started to laugh, to sweat, to feel something he hadn't felt since he was a boy. Genuine joy. That night, Alexander returned to his luxurious apartment, but everything felt different. The glass walls that once gave him a sense of power now seemed cold and empty. He sat on the couch, still with dust on his shoes, and reflected on what Luis had said, "No one is too old to have fun." Those words echoed in his mind like a persistent refrain. For the first time in years, Alexander didn't open his laptop to check emails. Instead, he found himself staring out the window, thinking about the past few days. He had spent his life accumulating wealth, power, and recognition. But for what? What was the point of it all if he had no one to share it with? He thought about Luis's laughter, his ability to find happiness in the simplest things, and felt a pang of envy mixed with admiration. That night, he barely slept. Something inside him had awakened, an unease he couldn't ignore. He knew something had to change, but he didn't know where to start. The next day, Alexander decided to return to the neighborhood. This time, he didn't take his chauffeured car. He took a taxi and walked the last few blocks, wanting to experience the place in a more authentic way. He carried a backpack filled with new soccer balls and gear, a spontaneous gesture he wasn't sure how the children would react to. When he found Luis and the other kids, he showed them what he had brought. The reaction was immediate. Shouts of excitement, hugs, and laughter. The children ran back and forth, testing the new balls and organizing impromptu games. Luis, his eyes shining, came up to Alexander and said, "Thank you. Are you going to play with us again?" Alexander nodded. But this time, he wasn't just a player. As they played, he began to listen. Luis told him about his dreams of becoming a professional soccer player to support his mom. Other kids shared their own stories. A girl who dreamed of becoming a doctor, a boy who wanted to be a teacher. Each story was a reminder of something Alexander had forgotten. Dreams aren't measured in money, but in purpose. Over time, Alexander's visits to the neighborhood became more frequent. It wasn't just about playing soccer with the kids. It was about learning. Luis, with his innocence and childlike wisdom, taught Alexander more about life than any mentor or book ever had. He showed him that happiness wasn't found in grand, ostentatious things, but in simple moments, shared laughter, kind gestures, genuine connections. Alexander began making changes in his life. He reduced his hours at the office and dedicated more time to activities that truly fulfilled him. He got involved in community projects, using his business expertise to help improve conditions in Luis's neighborhood. He created educational programs, built a proper soccer field, and set up a fund to support the kids' dreams. But more than anything, he learned to be present, to enjoy the moment, to find joy in the little things. His social circle also shifted. Superficial meetings with ambitious colleagues were replaced by heartfelt gatherings with people who shared his newfound purpose. He even reconnected with his family, rediscovering the value of the relationships he had once neglected. Years later, Alexander continued visiting the neighborhood. Luis, now a teenager, had joined a soccer academy thanks to Alexander's support. Every time Alexander watched him play, he felt a mix of pride and gratitude, not just because he had helped change the boy's life, but because the boy had changed his. One afternoon, as he watched Luis play in a local tournament, Alexander reflected on how far he had come. He remembered the first time he saw Luis, chasing a soccer ball down a dusty street, and how that seemingly insignificant encounter had transformed his entire world. I had everything, but nothing fulfilled me until I saw him. That thought brought a smile to his face, because now he understood that happiness wasn't in money, titles, or recognition. True happiness was in connections, in being present, in giving without expecting anything in return. And thanks to Luis, he had learned how to live. If you ever feel like something is missing, if success leaves you empty, remember this. Happiness isn't in what you accumulate, but in what you share. Perhaps, like Alexander, you just need to look around and allow yourself to learn from someone you least expect. Because sometimes, those who have the least are the ones who know the most about how to truly live. If this story touched your heart, imagine what we can achieve together. Subscribe and give it a like to keep spreading light, because this is just the beginning of something great.